Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Milan Patel, co-founder and CEO of Pathogen DX. Thank you very much for joining me today, Milan.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me today.
All right, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review or just a thumbs up on YouTube. Finally, if you want to reach the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. All right, Milan, I wanted to start with how you got involved in the cannabis industry. What brought you here?
Great starting question, and thank you for that. What brought me here into the cannabis industry is basically, I had invested in a company back in early 20, I think it was 2000 and late 2010, I believe, around that time, and it was a diagnostics company, and it was focused on human and clinical diagnostics. What actually, we've been all going through the last 2 years with COVID. Effectively, you test on human subjects, and the company was specifically grant funded, in terms of developing new, innovative technologies for genetics testing. And in particular, this was the purpose of that particular investment was for organ transplant, like my kidney being matched into your body, like an organ donor recipient, in terms of the simplicity of it. But the challenge was that the market wasn't big enough for that. It was, you would think everybody's talked about, hey, organ transplant market must be a huge market, but at that point in time, it was $1 billion market. So it's small in comparison to even today the size of the cannabis industry, if you think about it, and even the food or the real human clinical diagnostics, like the COVID and the respiratory diagnostics market, is massive. It's like $100 billion, right?
Yeah.
COVID probably added, a couple of zeros to that, just like probably Amazon and Tesla have.
Oh, I know. I added a couple of zeros just with my family's testing in and out of daycare alone.
There you go. So every family's had to contribute that, and it's exponentially increased the size of the market. So I took a step back and said, look, we're not thinking big enough. I realized that we were, I paused for a second. I realized we were sort of at war with pathogens, everything. When you look at the foodborne outbreaks, you look at water contamination, you look at agricultural products, and you look at even environmental, and now even us, every single human being on the planet was impacted by a viral pathogen. So being at war with pathogens, we really didn't have the armory or the ammunition to really tackle it head on the right way. And what we had is we had a really different type of technology that could do the job much simpler, much better, and more cost affordably, more, from an economic perspective. But then I just realized that we really didn't have the money to take this particular type of technology to the FDA at that point in time. We know that at the end of the day, when we're going to get federalized and nationalized, this industry is big enough as it is, and it's continuing to grow, that it will become federalized. And when it does, what's going to happen is at that point, companies like ours that are developing testing kits will need to go through the FDA process. And we knew that will ultimately that opportunity will come. So what I did was I took a step back and I said, where is it that, at that point in time, I can get real commercial traction with this type of technology? And the light bulb went on. It was cannabis. I really didn't know how, but then so what we did was we backed up the lorry. We sort of said, we've got this technology to a bunch of 2 or 3 labs. Steep Hill Lab was the first one. There was a lab in California, Colorado, and a lab in Washington. We said, here, take this equipment, see what it does for you. So after 3 months, they're like, this is pretty cool. This is really cool. They're like, this might even help us. And so what was happening is in the cannabis sector, your cultivators are dealing with a lot of bacterial and fungal pathogens, and even viral ones now with latent hop virus. So at the end of the day, what we realized was that this technology had a real perfect fit, hand in glove with addressing pathogens or bacterial and fungal contamination in cultivation facilities on the crop or on the flower or on the matrix that winds up in labs. And we realized we really have a solution that now fits this kind of industry. And that's how we got involved, knowing that let's go into the cannabis industry where the state level regulations prove and show that this type of technology works for the regulations at that state level, knowing that ultimately we'll have to do it at the federal level. And that's how we got involved.
So specifically, what is the technology and how does it enable, very fast cannabis testing?
Yeah, so great question. The technology is effectively called microarray. And so microarray is like basically a chip that we printed on a glass surface. Now the chip that we printed what you're printing is effectively each of the targets you're looking for, such as E. coli or salmonella, which we've all heard of. And then in the world of cannabis, we're starting to hear of aspergillus, and there are pathogenic versions like flavus, fumigatus, niger, and terreus. Those are the harmful ones versus the non-harmful ones. There are 3 that are necessarily not harmful. So you got to be able to be specific and know that to identify the harmful. So what we did is we've got a proprietary patented inkjet process where we print the genetic sequences of all of those pathogens on a glass surface. So what you're doing is you're effectively in a single 1 gram sample, whether it's flour or non-flour matrix, when you process it, you're dropping that amplified sample with its DNA, and it sort of binds very quickly like a zipper, right away with its complementary DNA strands, and basically gets a match. So effectively, what it does is you're not really sort of doing what other industries and other methods have been applied, such as petri dish testing, which takes 3 to 5 to 7 days, because you're cooking that sample, waiting for stuff to grow. So this is a molecular technology that right away is a very targeted approach that looks for within that sample those pathogens, and you're looking for all of them in the same sample, not one at a time, like in the classic Adam Smith assembly line model, right? Mm-hmm. So it's called multiplexing. So it looks for all the pathogens all in the same sample. So you're able to get a result in 6 hours versus 2 days with other molecular platforms and 3 to 5 days for petri dish testing. And in the case of a very valuable crop like cannabis, this is really critical to know the answer within the same day that the sample's walking into the lab, right? That's how our technology works, and it's called multiplex microarray. And you're looking for multiple targets all in the same sample.
Well, I hear you cut it down from 3+ days down to 6 hours. I mean, is there any sort of sacrifice in terms of accuracy or anything like that you get in other testing that you don't get with your tech?
Actually, it's a great question. It's actually even more accurate, primarily because what we do is on that glass surface that I mentioned, where we print the little probes which have the genetic sequences of E. coli, salmonella, and the aspergillus species. We print them in triplicate. So there's 3 probes for E. coli, 3 probes for salmonella, 3 probes for aspergillus flavus, and so forth. So what you're doing is you're doing 3 separate, tests per sample coming in. So you're triplicate testing and confirming that your answer is absolutely accurate. So it's called specificity. Did you really find the targeted organism you're looking for? And we would say yes, because we've confirmed it best out of 3. So in fact, it's even more accurate. And the second part of it is when you're amplifying that sample, and I know I'm getting a little bit technical here, but when you take that 1 gram of flour and you put it in one a Ziploc bag with water, you shake it up, you draw that juice out of the water, and then you spin it a couple of times, and then you form these little pellets. So the pathogens, they're live pellets. So we break those pellets down, and that's where the DNA is in there. So when we amplify it, we're using what is called Endpoint Pcr. So it's a very powerful amplification of those pathogenic strands of DNA in multiple millions and millions of samples, but it continues to amplify to its end primers, meaning that when the chemistry is fully used, as opposed to qPCR, which stops the reaction after it's a certain threshold. So its ability to identify that is even more accurate and more sensitive.
Are there any pathogens that it misses?
Generally, no, because at the end of the day, what we do is we only target what we're looking for. Now, in the case of all of our assays are now AOAC certified. So when you're doing that, there's a thing called inclusivity, which is pathogens you're only being asked to look for. And that's where I say that we've printed the genetic sequences of exactly those pathogens and not something else, not its cousin who you're not looking for. So there's also the case of what's called exclusivity, meaning we don't want these pathogens. So when we go through a full validation, we have to run 50 different other pathogens that are closely but not exactly and different enough that you don't want to pick those out, because that would give you sort of a false positive.
Okay. Another thing, when I hear you cutting it down to 6 hours, is the ROI has to be almost instantaneous.
Yes, because think about if you just took the value of the product, which is a fantastic question you're saying. If I'm paying $2,000 per whatever, right, per pound, right? If it's that's a lot of economics for that type of product. And so every hour you're waiting, if there's an outbreak in your cultivation facility and you've been using petri dish testing and it doesn't give you an answer to 3 to 5 days, think about how much of that crop is going to be infested with the pathogen and the value of the crop. So yes, it's exactly that. To the cultivator, it should matter, and it should matter that it becomes exponentially economically catastrophic at the end of the day if you don't get that answer quick enough.
So who is using it? Is it specific testing labs that has your technology, or do specific operators have it in-house?
So right now, our technology is used by pretty much all the certified independent testing labs across the country. We have about 110 labs running this technology day in, day out. And these are basically compliance samples that are mandated under a regulatory framework where the samples get traveled under a chain of custody from a cultivator, and then ultimately get tested. And the results get sent through basically their chain of custody software before they get released out to the dispensary to be sold on the retail market. We have a product called EnviroX, which really has 50 pathogens all in a single test, in a single well, which is not just pathogens that can hurt you and me, David. It's also plant pathogens that can hurt the plants, such as Botrytis, Fusarium, powdery mildew. So this particular product can be, we're targeting to all of the growers, because under the current, where we're heading overall is, it was great for the past few years that, okay, we're starting to get on our feet. But ultimately, as we sort of, converge into that federalized, nationalized model, if and when the FDA or the right regulatory agency comes on board, they're going to ask this industry to comply to what is called CGMP, Controlled Good Manufacturing Practices. And when they asked us to do that, you have to know that the environment you're growing your crop in is going to be free of all of those pathogens, not just from a compliance perspective, but from a production perspective. So that's going to mean, where did you get your soil from? How clean is your water? Is your air clean enough in terms of what you're growing in, and even from an OSHA perspective? So our bigger market will ultimately be the cultivators and growers, because that particular product, EnviroX, is perfectly suited, because we can actually, within 6 hours, tell you exactly where the hot zones are for these pathogens that are growing. They can cordon those zones off. They can sterilize those zones or remediate them before it spreads to the rest of the crop and or the plant. And if it gets it's like the classic example that if we don't clean our house, there's going to be mold somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's where we believe that we've developed a portfolio of products and technology that span across the entire supply chain, all the way from growers to producers, processes, and even the independent testing labs. So the actual product coming out of that is as pristine, pure, and ultimately safe and healthy for the consumer.
Well, you kind of answered my follow-up, but so it's understood that operators eventually at some point should have these in-house. How would they use them? I mean, would it be part of just a regular SOP in terms of standing or taking samples from various parts around the grow?
Yeah, they would use it for quality control. So that's a brilliant question. There's the current regulations mandate that actual samples need to go to a lab for the actual compliance testing, what the state is mandating the growers to send to an independent lab. But within the growers, they would do it what are called quality control samples to make sure that the growing conditions are producing clean samples, that the infrastructure around it, like the fans within an internal grow, are not blowing spores, all over the place, not just on the canopy of the plant, but even if it's, on drains, on door handles, on anything that's high touch surfaces, traffic zones, because that's where you can still have some problems within growing within a clean environment. So, that's sort of how I see the cultivators using. And what we have is we have a very simple technology that can do that within a point of care collection, a point of care type of platform that can do that,
Can you describe what that device looks like and how it operates? So is it sort of like a standalone device that you are plugging a swab into? How does it work?
Yeah, so it's basically a swab at the end of the day. What you would do is you would heat that swab up. You would basically lyse the sample, meaning you're breaking it down, and then you would do a quick what is called a amplification step, and then you would then wash it, and then you would just image it. That's it. So it's a very simple process at the end of the day. But it would there's a difference between running high throughput number of samples in a lab versus one-offs, and that's what we're focused on in the labs, in the cultivation space place, to make it very simple, very easy, but have that accuracy.
You mentioned that it's going to play a big role, particularly as federal legalization comes through. But I have to imagine that this is also going to play a big role in preventing product recalls. And I mean, we've seen more and more recalls come up, particularly because of mold. 2 weeks ago, we saw it in Claiborne County flour. It has to be a huge tool in preventing recalls. And, one of the big things I hear all the time is protecting your brand. And I mean, it has to be, in terms of a risk assessment, of important tool in that as well.
Yeah, both are phenomenal points you're making around risk mitigation at the end of the day. And, if we're the size of the food safety industry, which will ultimately get there, I think, I can't, doubt that we'll have that number of recalls if we're not careful. So, and the food industry is super careful, because at the federal level, they mandated that each of the food processing plants have to swab surfaces. Any food contact surfaces have to be swabbed daily. And they have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And that's what in a simplistic manner is called HACCP, hazard analysis critical control points. So when you apply this to the cannabis, the cannabis market, and specifically the brand, we've had massive recalls recently. Michigan had one of the largest recalls. I think it was like 238 million. It's significant. It was all around aspergillus. Okay, so what it is that the driving force of why we're pushing with this type of technology in our EnviroX product is that controlled environment within the grow. If a grower doesn't know that they may know humidity, light, moisture, and air and temperature, there are 4 or 5 variables that really play into how much mold there is in their facility. And if they even spend preventative environmental monitoring, which is, hey, let's just, and it's a fractional of a cost of the value of all their crop. If they swab every week for, let's just say 52 weeks, we'll be able to help them identify how often mold is reoccurring, how often salmonella is reoccurring, or E. coli or other aspergillus, and they'll be able to get a spectral 3-dimensional view of this over the course of one full year, different seasonal effect, the summer, the winter, the humidity, for them to know how to manage those variables that will play into producing and growing the most optimal product without it growing a lot of mold and then having that recall. I hope that sort of helps answer your question.
It does. Is cannabis testing as good as it can be?
It's getting there. I think it can be much better. I think the challenges we've seen is lab shopping. I think that the labs have done a phenomenal job because, I think when you look at the regulations that have been imposed on the industry, even at the state level, some of them are more rigorous than the EPA on for example, pesticides, which is phenomenal, right? But there's a balance between, the pendulum can't shift too far to the right on too much testing, because then at that point in time, it's not economically viable.
Mhm.
And so you have to focus on things that are truly, you want to have sensible regulations. And sensible regulations at the state level will ultimately fruition, I believe, into sensible regulations at the national level. And so I do think that we've done a tremendous job in cannabis testing, but the thing is, there is still this propensity for, when you look at molecular technology, and if I say to you, David, this is your DNA, the result of your DNA, and what could happen is in some of the history we've had in the cannabis sector, whether it's at the lab side or the grower side, they want to refute the result of a DNA test because they'd rather prefer culture, because culture can be gamed. You can sterilize, you can microwave, you can remediate the sample and then go in because you've effectively killed the bug off, or you may have shocked it and put it non-viable. Where I'm going with this is that we have to recognize that molecular technology is here to stay. Otherwise, why didn't the whole COVID world just culture viruses in some big, in some big lab? But that's my point is that we've made humongous strides, but we need to get better. But we also have to make sure that we're on the right side of reasonable regulations that make sense for the full industry, not just for labs, but for the growers, for the producers, for the consumer as well.
Well, on the topic of reasonable regulations, I understand that, didn't you recently provide guidance to New York State regarding the testing for medical marijuana?
Yes. So we basically took a step back and said, generally our approach is that we can target 50 or 100 different pathogens in a single test. And if all 100 of them were harmful to humans, to the plants, to environmentally, then it would make sense. But there's not 100 of them. We know that in the cultivation grows, there can be up to 50 pathogens that are totally harmful. So what we did is we worked with the state of New York and thanks, they've done a phenomenal job. They've got about, I think, 15 pathogens per sample, but these are all predicated on real cases, right? Whether it's E. coli or Salmonella or Clostridium or Aspergillus, they're Listeria. So the basis of all of this was working together with them in terms of discussing how, what organisms make sense from a clinical case perspective. Did somebody previously get hurt or die, right? That's the basis of it. Because you can say, well, David and Milan are healthy enough, so we don't really have to worry about that. No, it's not about that. It's about somebody who is probably not as healthy as David and Milan, maybe have pre-existing conditions or immunocompromised. So you've got to design the regulations around those people, right? And so that's how we worked. And it was a 2 to 3 year stint in working closely with them on what makes sense. And of course, a lot of that input was from the Department of Health. These folks have been doing this for decades, half a century, whatever, a century, and they know the bugs that really hurt or kill people. So they've got enough epidemiological and clinical evidence to say these are things. So that's how we sort of work with them, with the state of New York. Before
New York, were you involved on the regulatory side in other states or territories, or is it something new?
This is sort of something new. We were trying to work with regulators, but I think it was still in the first few years of infancy where it was a storming forming. Now I truly see the norming really moving, and where all the labs seem to be on the same page, right? Mm-hmm. And it's starting to feel like a real national model, right? At the end of the day, before it was every lab, every state was doing its own thing. Now, even though it seems like they're all doing their own thing, but the thing they're doing seems like it's singing off the same sheet of music. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I want to make sure that we have, like I said, sensible regulations, number one, and number two, we address these types of regulations that mirror the federal model. And what I mean by that is if we're too light on regulations at the state level and we federalize in the next 2, 3, whatever number of years, it's going to be a massive shock to our system if we're too light. So we have to understand where are the feds in their mindset from looking at the plant as an agricultural product versus a medical product under the Food and Drug Administration, or a supplemental or an edible under food. So you have to take that view on what's the FDA BAM, which is called the Bacterial Analytical Manual. What is the USDA version of it? What is the AOAC version of it? So there's this marrying effect the integration effect that needs to happen between these regulations that we're living with today and what it could be tomorrow if it was federalized. And we have to transition to that point, because you and I going to the FDA commissioner tomorrow when it is federalized and trying to tell them, hey, believe us, we've done the math. Yeah, it's not going to fly too much, because they're going to say, actually, we've got regulations under a pharmaceutical model that says you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which you're missing. So I know I'm drawing this thing out, but I think that this is a very important point for all of your viewers, and that mindset needs to be inbuilt today for us, so that we can basically, we're traveling that trajectory in a comfortable manner and it not be a shock, you see.
No, I completely agree. Where a lot of people think there's going to be great disruption with federal legalization, I agree with you, where it needs to be this gradual progression where we're constantly getting better, so that way we're at least closer to the end goal when it comes through. Do you work, how do you keep the pulse of what federal legalization might look like from a regulatory perspective? Is it going to be sensible regulation, or is it going to be really over the top at first?
Yeah. So first of all, let me answer your question. And these are fantastic questions, David. I mean, I really like this. It's thought-provoking. So how do we stay ahead of the curve, right? Or what we do is, if we stuck in the same industry at the state level, then we really don't know the global view of it, like the federal view or the national view, and even the international view, right? So the opportunity we have with not just our technology, but our technology has applications in the food space, in the agricultural space, in the environmental space, and even in the clinical human diagnostic space. And so what we've done is we've taken a very proactive approach in working with the likes of the FDA. In fact, our technology has been authorized by the FDA for COVID testing, COVID testing and even variant testing, which they've looked at and they've authorized. So from a clinical perspective, they have hands-on experience about our platform, our technology, and how that would compare to the regulations in human virus testing, for example. Okay. Mm-hmm. In the case of USDA, we've worked with them on the food testing side with leafy greens. So we know what bugs matter. So part of it is it's not as so much of a that experience is really key to understand how different is that experience in getting not just your test authorized, but what are the requirements, and the rigor by which the FDA or the USDA or these federal agencies ask is a completely different level of expectation, to be brutally honest with you. And because they've gone through this for thousands of manufacturers like us, and it's robustness, it's reproducibility, it's consistency, it's shelf life. These are words I'm spouting off, but this is what the FDA expects. So some may think, wow, this is too much. But at the end of the day, this is what it needs to be. If you say that you and I were, for example, growing a medical marijuana, and we had a medical marijuana cultivation facility, and we have a specific strain for migraines, right? That's a medical condition. Mm-hmm. So now you and I want to grow a particular plant that might have a strain to help therapeutically for migraines. So at the end of the day, they're going to assess not just the clinical benefit, but they're going to make sure that your plant, our plant that we're growing, that whatever we're testing the right things for it for that medical condition. So I know I'm giving a long drawn out answer, but I think at the end of the day, it seems like somebody will say, no, that's these feds, they don't know what they're doing. They do know what they're doing. They know what they're doing because they've got so much sheer experience about it. And the benefit is for us to learn what it is sooner than later and understand how we take the appropriate baby steps to get to that point. as if it's almost like we're the cannabis industry, but if we mock play it out and start to add these additional requirements in, like you said, it's a natural shoe-in when it becomes FDA, USDA, OSHA, EPA, other agencies.
So something else that's been disruptive in the cannabis industry has been the emergence of Delta 8. And I had seen an article about how the cannabis industry should be worried about Delta 8. Is that because of different testing regulations surrounding the strain?
I think it's a function of not just the different testing regulations surrounding the strain, but it's a loophole to a large degree around what can happen, for the Delta 8 to become sort of an unsafe product in the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that ultimately testing regulations can catch up to this, but the goal of the industry is not necessarily producing strains that are going to become there are splinter strains out there that you sprout a more potent strain. It's the equivalent of Omicron. Okay, mm-hmm. Do we want that type of labeling and credibility and reputation that suddenly there's a strain out there that's more potent and without having the benefit of it? What's the point of it, right? That's the question. So, I think that I'm not directly addressing your question head on, but I think the activity of creating a Delta 8 may have some certain benefits and positives, but overall, it's sort of not normal, quote unquote, a standard approach to the industry of what one should do. At the end of the day, it's like the equivalent of if you're growing a crop and suddenly somebody says, "Hey, guess what? I'm growing opium tomorrow," and right, and I know it's there's a certain level of humor, but there's a certain level of seriousness to this about getting a good scorecard in the eyes of the federal government, right? Because the more we do of these Delta 8s, the less chances we're going to become of being accepted as like the next pharmaceutical version of it in terms of the plant, right? And they won't take us as seriously. I hope that helps.
You guys are also really involved in food safety. Could you tell me a little bit about that part of the business and sort of how much of your business is cannabis, how much is food safety, and then how much is COVID now?
So COVID was a predominant portion of our business in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. And to a large degree, we think it's going to stay for a while. Cannabis was about 60 to 70% of our business before the pandemic hit. It's now I would say it's still a healthy portion, roughly around half of our revenue and our growth is all cannabis related, because I think the good news is even through the pandemic, the industry really stayed super healthy, meaning I think the culture in itself was very good at pivoting. It had to pivot in the last 5 years, right? And so in the food safety sector, we're growing and we're about 10 to 15%. And what we've done is we've taken a lot of the food safety regulations are still based upon enrichment based, because you have to, as opposed to a 1 gram cannabis flower, which you can, you don't have to put it in a broth and let it cook overnight for 2 nights and then put it on an agar plate and then watch colonies grow. In the case of the food safety, you have to do some of that enrichment primarily because you're dealing with a larger mass of food. You're sometimes dealing with 25 grams of romaine lettuce, so 375 grams of hamburger meat, right? Or Angus steak, right? So in that particular case, it's very hard to find E. coli quickly enough. So what we've done there is we've accelerated that turnaround time with a shortened enrichment, but with our super sensitive technology, identify those bugs very quickly. So we recently did a 2-year collaboration with the USDA where they use our technology, and they were able to show that for romaine lettuce, what would normally take a 4 to 5 day turnaround time for detection of E. coli or salmonella, we're able to get it down to 11 hours, even with a short enrichment. Now, in the case of romaine lettuce, think about the shelf life of lettuce, right? If you can get 1 or 2 or 3 days improvement, you and I and our families are getting freshness, right, at the same price, and you're not having as much of a you're not having as much of a so-called stale product out there. You're getting fresher product that's out to the consumers, and that matters.
Mm-hmm. You were with the explosion of COVID coming on the scene, and like you said, the healthy growth that cannabis had over the last couple of years. How did you keep up?
It was very difficult. I mean, I'll be honest with you. It was super. Now, and I'm not saying COVID's over. I think that we had to pivot, and we didn't just pivot in one place. We pivoted across 2 or 3 markets all at the same time. And so from where I come from, it's about survivalistic, right? You've got to survive. And if you stick to one swim lane, that swim lane could dry up of water, right, at the end of the day. So part of it was that the culture, I fundamentally believe that there's the human capacity is there and the will is there to multitask, right? Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the day, what we do is we're able to the same kind of core approach in designing a test for COVID versus a test for food safety or a test for cannabis. It's the same knitting. It's just that you're knitting 3 different things, and you've got to know how to knit. And the more you knit, the more efficient you're going to get. So whether you're looking for E. coli on cannabis, you're looking for E. coli on salmonella, you may be looking for E. coli on a human sample, right? That's for a GI issue or whatever. And so we had to, we had the opportunity to pivot, and on March 2020, because when there was a national pandemic, I was in a board meeting with my board, and I said, this is our moment. This is our chance to show that this technology actually has the opportunity to really help the country, help the world. And, all of our employees stepped up. I mean, they literally, it was like a call to all of them. And they said, we can do this. And in 6 weeks, we developed a test for COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And within 6 or 9 months, we developed a test that can predict for variants that were not just historical variants today and tomorrow in terms of emerging mutations. And so it's all in the mind that you can do something without burning them out. Now, that doesn't mean people struggled. I mean, they took on the challenge, but there was some people personally lost some family members, some friends. We probably all know somebody. So that took a personal tax mentally on some of our folks. And so, luckily we didn't lose anybody, but the bottom line is, it was a hard time in the last 22 months of just getting through. I mean, you or your family, my family, we all felt a little bit different. But I think coming back to this question is that if you can take a company culture through this and know that you can still swim in 3 swim lanes and make it to the finish line, that's phenomenal. And that's what my team is, because I want them to know that you can, if you set your mind to it, you can achieve anything you want, and you can.
So how long of a process did you say it was 6 weeks after that board meeting in March 2020 that you had a test?
Yeah. So it was 6 weeks, and then we had to go to the FDA process. So that was going back to one of your questions. Tell me how it is. Mm-hmm. So the FDA process took about a year. Oh, so wow. It just tells you that you really have to know how to work with the FDA, what they want, and be able to really deliver. And it's quite different as opposed to what we were going through between what's the state of California want versus the state of Michigan or the state of Colorado. So that lack of a national model and the framework that's on a regulatory side, which the FDA has, it took us a year for us to really understand what they want, why they want it, how they want it, how to communicate it, and the reasons for it. And it's very beneficial because it really does create a standard that you cannot typically game. I mean, we've seen the FDA call out some manufacturers of COVID tests because that's what their role is. And so, but they weren't there were thousands of companies, right? We were one of only 300 companies that got an FDA EUA authorization, but there were 3,000 to 4,000 companies applying in line. So that just gives you the immense sense of the job that they had to do, you know.
For that product development, how difficult was that? I mean, I have to imagine that some of your employees were quarantining, you know, or were you in the office? How were you able to do that redesign in 6 weeks under those conditions?
So initially, the good news is that a lot of that's a good question. A lot of the collateral is already out there for us to do it. So as soon as we know COVID was out there, the likes of the CDC issued the sequence of the virus. So we're able to design that very quickly. And the good news is we're not reliant on the same supply chain as all of the rest of the PCR companies. Our technology is very unique. So we have sort of an unlimited capacity. And so what we were able to do is we have a very ability, we're agile and we're super quick in our ability to design tests. In fact, we can get a test designed usually anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks. And that's how quickly we do it. So our team has about 20 to 30 years of experience doing that. It's like a team Ferrari or a team Porsche. They've been working together for about 20, 30 years. They know how to do this day in, day out. And so when it finally came to that, the good news is in this particular case, you can buy what is called synthetic virus, but it's not real virus from somebody's nose, okay? And so you can use that as a template to be able to test out if your test works or not. The bigger challenge was getting clinical samples, and clinical samples was very difficult because they weren't available initially everywhere because tests took about 4, 6, 12, 16 weeks before they were finally available where the mass population was starting to get tested. So think about if you have a test ready in 6 weeks, but you got a long wait before you can actually get clinical samples because that's what the FDA asks you to test. And then we had to quarantine people in different parts of the lab. So they were separated. We had to employ whatever policies were in place. We did have some outbreaks during the course of the year, but that was sort of normal. But to a large degree, it was only, people who were working on the assay that were, in the building initially,
From that 1 year process with the FDA, what parallels could you draw with a potential role with the FDA once federal legalization happens in cannabis?
I think that if you got a good rapport with them, you have to have credibility with them. So we now have an ongoing dialogue with the FDA, which helps because it's like it's a track record, okay? That you sort of know what they want. You're delivering what they're asking for and they're requesting. And so I think when it comes to the cannabis sector, I still think it'll be a very rigorous approach given the fact that the reputation the industry has sort of carried. And I think that certain things such as these recalls, such as the Michigan recall, and such as the vape crisis that we had several years ago, are blemishes for the industry to figure out itself that, if I say tomorrow when I submitted an FDA submission for cannabis testing, I'd have to do the same things I did for COVID. And if I do it on my own devices without them asking me, they were like, okay, this person or this company has previously submitted and they know what we want in anticipation of them asking us. And I think that will be much easier. But if there are companies that have no reputation or credibility with them or even an existing relationship, it's going to be much harder. It's going to be much longer. And that's just the fact of life,
Oh, yeah. What is your prediction for federal legalization?
I think that if we could solve the banking issue, I really do. I think we're on our way. And I think that at the end of the day, 39 states have medical marijuana. And I think that, each of the other states are going through their own process on adult, right? I think if we get to more than half the states in adult, I think it's going to be a watershed moment. I think you cannot have this size of an industry operating at the state level. And given that the federal government, from an economics perspective, I'm sure the Department of Treasury and Justice, especially Treasury, will not let an industry that's 20, 30, 50 billion off the hook in not having its main fair share of taxes, if you get my point. So I think we're not too far off, so long as it doesn't get, there's this tussle between, and not to get political, between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's really seeing the big picture at the end of the day of like, look, the states have spoken, right? The 100 states want this, that means the people have spoken. Therefore, at some point, it's going to become a federal agenda, because our own, our own senators and congresspeople have to go back to Washington and bring that subject up. It has to be a conversation. And when it becomes a conversation, it's going to need to table. So I think, the gravity is on it to make it happen. I don't know the time frame, because if we can be smart enough to not get too involved on the politic of everything, and there's a belief structure, right? That people have, they apply their own personal beliefs that this is a bad thing, this is a good thing, this is I don't want this, or I want this. At the end of the day, they have to step back and they have to separate their own personal wishes from what the people want, if that's a good way to end it.
I mentioned it earlier, but people are worried about FDA's involvement in the industry. But you have this very unique perspective from a food, cannabis, and COVID side. What can companies do to take some of these baby steps to make sure they're prepared, so that way when legalization turns on, they're not left in the back, way behind everybody else?
I think the one thing that one should do, because the FDA in itself will not take meetings initially, or they may have certain meetings around CBD, which they've had around clinical trials. But I think it's important that companies, they have access to FDA regulators and FDA consultants, FDA regulators who may have, quote unquote, gone into the private sector. So it's important for companies to sort of, approach them and learn, the roadmap, right? Learn the blueprint, of what would it look like if it was tomorrow, right? And so that gives a sense, even mentally, because maybe by absorption and assimilation, once you look at something like, okay, what's it going to look like? Then you can start thinking through and breaking it down in terms of a plan. And you can always, internally go through the motions of saying, if this was an FDA submission tomorrow, what would we really deliver? And working with those types of individuals, those FDA consultants, they'll bring you closer to what the mindset would be and what the ask would be from that federal agency.
Before we get out of here, is there anything in particular that we might have missed, or that you want to make sure the CEN audience knows about Pathogen DX?
Yeah, I think, thank you for this opportunity again, David. I think that we've covered a lot of topics, right? Mm-hmm. And I fundamentally, I've been thinking a lot about a lot of the podcasts and opportunities like this that I've done. And I really do think that I'm a very passionate guy, and I fundamentally think that the industry has a lot of passion. There's a reason why, it's grown this much, and it's continuing to grow. But I think at the end of the day, I think that when something gets too large, then regulations come in, and big regulation can come in. So I'm not saying not to go too large, but if we're going to go too large, it should just go large on dollars. It should go large on safety, large on purity, large on consumer and patient, satisfaction, right? Those are important points. But what that takes is, as sort of a technology CEO in an industry that's not just cannabis, but it's in food and it's in clinical diagnostics. And what I see, the lens and the optics I see is it's the behavior and the mindset. And we have to continue to adapt and pivot our behavior and mindset, and really, really lean on our skis a little bit more of embracing, versus pushing back, right? And I see the industry now starting to embrace with the state model, right? The intrastate model, the interstate model. Now the federal model, we're going to need to step up. So my last points around this is the big MSOs, the CEOs, they're their companies are all measured on Wall Street. So they've got their scorecard, but at the end of the day, if they were the equivalent of the Pfizers or the Bristol Myers or the Regenerons in the cannabis world, what is it that they would need to? How would they need to act? Well, it's besides just growing a plant and driving profitability in terms of a stock share price basis, right? It's about what do you need to do elsewhere around the CGMP, around the HACCP, right? Around that federal model. And I'm impinging on us to start thinking and behaving that way, like as if it's a federal company, even though we're not. That's what we need to do. I have to do that if I want to operate with the big boys and girls in the pharmaceutical space, in the medical space, in the agricultural or the food safety space. And that just takes a different type of growing up. And we need to, just like we're growing plant, we got to grow up individually.
You said we are at war with pathogens. Are we ever not going to be at war with pathogens?
We are never going to not be at war with pathogens, but we can do a lot. And you've seen the innovation when an industry like the fossil fuel industry with the cars running on just gas. And then it took one guy to decide to disrupt that industry with an electric vehicle, right? Tesla, mm-hmm. Right? So it can happen, right? In my passion is that if we can avoid using antimicrobials, antibiotics, right? To reduce the amount of that being used on our food produce, on our agricultural produce, then we're doing the right thing, because what we're starting to see in other industries is antibiotic resistance. And we don't want to go there where you're spraying something that's more powerful, using a more powerful antibiotic to kill a more powerful superbug. That's the war with pathogens. So using technologies like ours, which we can quickly identify the pathogen, we can identify what is antibiotic or antimicrobial resistance, will drive a different level of practice in the hands and when the cultivator rolls his sleeve up, as opposed to just dousing it with more, pesticides, or more, giving in the agricultural industry, giving pigs and hens and cows more antimicrobials so they don't get sick. And then we're consuming food that has been ingested with those. So my envision is that at the end of the day, we're never not going to be at war with pathogens. It's the degree by which we use this information to do things smartly, so we're not dousing more gas and fuel on the fire that we already have.
Right? Just be better.
Let's be better and be smarter.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Milan. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. I truly enjoyed it. This was a great conversation. It's almost like it was a coffee fireside chat, because you provided some really awesome, thought-provoking questions, and I really, truly loved and enjoyed it today.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review. Finally, if you want to reach the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. All right. For Milan Patel, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.